It's my pleasure to welcome you today. Am I off?
Yeah, you're good. Sorry.
Thank you, Wes. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this conversation with Dr. Catherine Turner. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you.
I wanted to take a minute to recognize the other members of the Transitional Justice and Rule of Law Interest Group. I'm vice chair along with Tiffany Brownlee-Meyer, and our co-chairs are Noha Abuldahab, Milena Stereo, and Rachel Lopez, who all played a role in organizing this event and have been in contact with Dr. Turner about her research and scholarship for months and years. So I would like to take a minute to invite everyone to also feel free to tweet about the event and or follow us, our interest group on Twitter, and the handle is at TJROLIG, at TJ Rolig. I can pop that in the chat, and I will also drop into the chat Catherine's biography and my biography that were sent out with the invitation in the interest of time. And also to link to Dr. Turner's webpage, rethinkingpeacemediation.com, as a handy reference. I think those are all the kind of intro announcements, except that if you have a question, please feel free to chat me privately. I'll be monitoring the chat, or you can feel free to drop it into the chat for everyone. And it would be great if you feel comfortable and you want to come off video to ask your question. When I see that you have the question, I will introduce you. But also, if you prefer I read it, you can write me that in the chat, and you do not have to come off video. It's as you wish. So Catherine, I wanted to talk to you about some of the themes at the heart of your research, which I think are really of interest to the ASIL community and friends of ASIL and people interested in transitional justice, peacemaking, and peace mediation. You've written a lot and spoken about the interdependency between transitional justice and peace mediation. Could you please tell us a little bit more about these linkages?
Yeah, so first of all, can I say thank you very much to the interest group for the invitation to have this conversation this evening, because this is, this has been something I've been thinking about, as you say, for quite a long time, that, traditionally we start with transitional justice and peace processes as, I suppose, almost two parallel processes, that the process is happening, and then the transitional justice is something that we talk about separately, and they've developed as these two parallel areas of expertise. And I have somehow found myself sitting between them and thinking, actually, these aren't really parallel at all. There are a lot of interdependencies and interlinkages, both in terms of the subject matter and the context in which we discuss these ideas, but also then in terms of the goals and the tools and things that we could be thinking about. So, and I suppose that the starting place is, we've got this body of literature on the peacemaker's paradox, for example, and the tensions between peace and justice and how to introduce those. And that's really the starting place as well. If we think about peace mediation as the context of transitional justice and the way in which the nature of a peace mediation process and the way in which it's designed is going to fundamentally impact on the possibilities of transitional justice after an agreement is reached, for example. And I think, through the history of transitional justice, that it's really apparent, where you've got a transition process where there's a real commitment to accountability as part of that transition. We've got a strong commitment to transitional justice that then plays out into mechanisms and laws to try and bring that around. But then we had this period of time where we had predominantly negotiated settlements. So there wasn't such a clear-cut outcome, and we were having to negotiate much more the terms of what a transition was going to look like. And I suppose when we think of that period in terms of transitional justice, what becomes quite clear is the risk and the way in which transitional justice really becomes integrally dependent on what's negotiated and the way in which that negotiation is approached. So all of a sudden thinking in peace mediation around who's invited to the table, what's the agenda of the talks, what's the aim of the talks, what are we trying to get to as an outcome, all of these are going to impact on transitional justice. And we see particularly in this case, we've a number of examples where you've got two relatively strong blocs vying for power, in many cases agreeing to power sharing, and that this then enshrines into agreements. Oh, they're my opus lights. This then enshrines into agreements the power of these particular parties to define what happens with transitional justice. And so while we might get lip service to the idea of justice, while we might get sort of vague commitments made, as time progressed, what we were seeing was that actually nothing was being done to implement this. And this is, fundamentally, this goes back to the peace mediation part of it, in terms of who was handed the power, who was handed the power to define what justice meant, and what justice was going to be delivered. And I think again then, with the most recent events in Afghanistan, we're seeing another development totally, so not even negotiated, not two even power blocks, but simply a victory, and so it raises real questions then around what is the meaning of justice in those circumstances, in terms of where you have a party who takes power by themselves, and who has no particular commitment to the idea of justice, and a less clear agenda on what transitional justice means in that particular context. Are we in that particular transition? And so I think these two are really interdependent, and you can understand a lot about one by reading about the other, how the other was designed, how the other was advocated, how the other was negotiated.
That's really interesting too, because a lot of times when we speak about justice and we speak about peace and the outcome of a peace settlement, another word that comes up a lot is accountability, holding actors to account for conflict, for a history of human rights abuse, recognizing and acknowledging victims and survivors. And so since your research also explores how justice is negotiated, how do you view that interplay between justice and peace? Yes, but also accountability in the processes of transitional justice or peace mediation?
Yeah, I think accountability is really one of the best examples of particularly the way in which transitional justice has shaped peace mediation, so that relationship going the other way around. So both transitional justice and peace mediation are professional fields and professional practices that have seen a real growth in normative frameworks and in kind of technical approaches to how we design policies, how we implement them, and how we evaluate them. And they're both going along on parallel lines in this regard, in that this has been happening in both fields. And so we initially, the question of accountability is one that comes from transitional justice and is brought to bear on peace mediation. So mediators are made to think about the question of accountability when they're talking to parties, and they're made to think about what are the rules here, and that this then shapes the peace mediation guidance itself. So compliance with normative frameworks becomes part of the guidance on peace mediation and part of the function of the peace mediator. And so the two develop along these lines of accountability as a core element of peace mediation, as well as something that will be delivered through transitional justice process following a peace mediation process. But I think it's also really interesting in terms of the way in which justice has come to be defined as well. The accountability is really very central in that, and there's a focus on the ways in which that can be leveraged in a peace mediation process, and the way in which a mediation process can be required to deal with that has kept a focus on fairly high level processes and fairly legal definitions of accountability and justice from that point of view. So the ability, for example, of states or of high-level multilateral organizations like the Security Council or the International Criminal Court to intervene in these processes to push for accountability as well, I think has really shaped the thinking and captured the imagination in terms of what transitional justice means in that context, in the way that has then become institutionalized in the definitions in some ways.
I also think that that's really hitting on one of kind of the core points of maybe contention, or maybe to phrase it more positively, a room for growth in transitional justice, which is coming at it from not only a legalistic perspective, like we need our lawyers, we need our attorneys, our judges, but we also need social scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, people with a background in mental health and trauma, in peace building and conflict resolution, and in, for example, gender studies. Um, and there's also, I think, kind of an interesting focus on transitional justice at the local level in many communities around the world. In societies with a history of human rights abuse or conflict, local groups are grappling with the past, are working on monuments and memorialization, school curriculum, a variety of issues. And then there's kind of these large global processes like the ICC, or things that kind of make the national or global headlines. So since another nexus on which your scholarship focuses is that of that local and the global, I was wondering if you could unpack that relationship, please, maybe using an example.
Yeah, and this is, I think, where I've really started to think about the question of the relationship between these two. So I often, and I do have done a lot of work with women's groups who are wanting to participate, trying to find ways and entry points into peace mediation processes. And often my role there is to teach them about transitional justice. And this has led to me doing a lot of questioning myself in terms of what am I teaching them in terms of, so I can come and I can teach them about the frameworks, and I can teach them about the mechanisms and the institutions and things like that. But often what I'm hearing from them is that this doesn't really address their needs or the way that they would design justice if it was up to them. And so it's, I have been thinking then and looking at both sets of literatures and how this disconnect between the international and the local comes up. It's documented as such in the peace mediation field. We talk about between the tracks, and we talk about the connections between the local and the global, and we acknowledge that problematic gap, and the way that a lot of the focus, a lot of the money goes to the high level processes, the technical processes that are more easily evaluated, and that it's very hard then to feed in insight and experience from the grassroots into those processes. And so we have this gap that Noah and I talk about a lot between those who experience injustice and making demands for justice, and those who then profess to have the expertise, so those who come and design the processes, advise the governments, advise the international organizations on what transitional justice is and what's required. And so, and as you say, there's really a very good, very solid body of literature that speaks to transitional justice and questions really the epistemic definition of justice, if you like. So looks at grassroots initiatives, looks at local initiatives, and tries to ask, well, what does this tell us about justice in transition and about what people need? And similarly, then we have the same happening in peace studies, so things like everyday peace. What is it that ordinary people are doing to try and live in violence, or to try and address or improve situations of violence? But again, these two bodies of literature are quite different. There's some overlap in terms of transitional justice and peace building, but not a huge dialogue yet. And then also it's mirrored in the peace mediation field, the difficulties in translating kind of local insight into global processes, and the risk that the global processes and the global frames squeeze out the local insight. Because fundamentally, if you want to be the advisor, if you want to be a transitional justice expert, for example, it's like we almost defer then to the referential, to the mechanisms, to the pillars, to the things that we know that are understood. That's kind of the common language of transitional justice. And so I think across both fields, it's a way, it's how we find ways to connect at the grassroots. So what's the learning from transitional justice and the scholars who are trying to understand what justice means to people who've experienced conflict on the one hand, and the scholars who are looking at how people who live within conflict conceptualize peace, conceptualize justice themselves, without it necessarily having to refer back to a specific set of mechanisms, whether that's defined by transitional justice or defined by peace mediation.
Have you ever seen it done well in which local insight was fed up into the more national, maybe not global level, maybe global, but national level work, or some examples of those voices being heard and acknowledged and kind of reshaping the path forward?
Well, I do see some attention to it being paid, particularly when it comes to women, women in peace processes and women's voices in transitional justice. Transitional justice advisors for the United Nations trying to create spaces to listen to women's experiences and to women's voices in terms of what they would like to see. I think the difficulty is breaking into the model of transitional justice, breaking into the kind of the pillars and the mechanisms, and finding ways to incorporate those different understandings of justice in that, not just reverting back to the technical one, but I think that's where I have seen the questions on the table, at least, and seen efforts by mediators and by those working in mediation teams to try and bring that forward and create spaces. And so I think that transitional justice actually has a bit to learn, or could usefully try and engage some of these tools of peace mediation, where we recognize the importance of dialogue for the sake of dialogue, and the importance of enabling people to kind of bring their own experience and their own understanding to the table, and try to find ways to feed that into bigger processes then as well.
Mm-hmm. I actually did want to ask you, given like your long scholarship on gender and the inclusion of women in peace mediation and negotiation, maybe if we broaden it a bit from the issue of gender and different identities along the gender spectrum to also include other traditionally excluded or marginalized groups, ethnic, religious, racial, and or other populations. How have you seen good examples of promoting inclusion, and how can practitioners in the peace mediation field, and I guess the transitional justice field as well, take practical steps to promote inclusive peace processes and inclusive TJ processes?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think this goes right back to where we started, which was for how the purpose of the process and as such the transition is defined from the outset, and a lot of these processes happen within quite narrow parameters in terms of how security is defined or how the success of a particular agreement is defined. And so it really does start there in terms of where the possibilities of inclusion come from. But that said, and while this is still the case, while the Security Council still defines the agenda, for example, there's a lot of good work being done to try and create and replicate, I suppose, models for inclusion and for broadening out. So in peace mediation, for example, there's a lot of talk at the moment of how we use digital technologies to broaden inclusion, to overcome some of the barriers that marginalized groups would face in trying to access even transitional justice processes. So where do these conversations happen? Who starts them? Who initiates them? Who decides who gets invited to take part in them? And one of the learnings that's coming out in peace mediation is that we can use digital tools to try and expand this, and to find ways to enable people to participate that mightn't have the opportunity to otherwise. And so if you're not free to travel to a capital city for a couple of weeks at a time, you can still from your home take part in an online consultation, for example. I mean, there's challenges around that as well in terms of people's online safety, people's access to data and electronic equipment and stuff like that. And also, there's a very real question about how that then feeds into broader processes, so that doesn't become isolated as something that's just talking for the sake of talking or ticking boxes, but that there's a meaningful way of influencing talks beyond that. That's one. And I suppose a lot of the infrastructure that's developed around women, peace, and security, so the ways in which women are supported and civil society are supported to participate. You can see that working across youth, peace, and security, for example, and being expanded potentially into other areas where people would be traditionally excluded from decision making or from conversations about power and about decisions. Yeah.
I did want to take a minute to recognize your website, rethinkingpeacemediation.com, which I'll drop into the chat. But I noticed there was a resources page there for those of us who are interested um, in learning more or in doing deep dives. Do you have resources, authors, websites, other kind of resource hubs that we can refer to build our knowledge?
Around inclusive processes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, TJ and peace mediation processes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a couple of reports on the website there that were commissioned for UN Women that look specifically, so kind of two types of resources: those that look at the thinking behind inclusion and what it is we're trying to achieve, and then those that look at the specific models for how we do it. And so there's reports around specifically how, if you want to invite women or to try and get women into processes that they would traditionally be excluded from, what types of mechanisms have been used in the past, what have been some of the benefits of that, in terms of how they've worked, and what have been some of the risks and some of the challenges, if you like, that hasn't worked just as well. And there's some around kind of supporting different roles and different ways of thinking about the question. So leadership, women's leadership is a theme that's coming out quite a bit in terms of how we recognize the different contributions that different people make. So it's not all about looking upwards towards one high level process, but the acknowledging and recognizing the importance of, and this applies for sure, not just to women, but to all groups who are working at the community level, particularly to prevent, to manage conflict, and to stop it from erupting into violence as well. So the reports on that as well.
Okay, thank you. I did want to turn to something that struck me in reading your biography. I noticed that you are from Northern Ireland and have studied and worked in Northern Ireland, England, and the Republic of Ireland. So I think a lot of people come to the peace building, peace mediation, international justice, or transitional justice kind of sphere for personal reasons or due to something from their lived experience. So I was wondering how your lived experience with conflict, with a landmark peace negotiation in our lifetimes, and a landmark agreement, and living in this current post-conflict climate has inspired or influenced your work and your decision to go into this work.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no there's no doubt that it has been influential. Although if you had asked me at the age of 21 whether this had shaped me at all, I would have said no, not at all, of course not. I came from an area, I grew up in an area that was relatively untouched by violence, and that was fairly mixed as well in terms of population. So I hadn't, by the age of 21, really seen the worst of Northern Ireland. But I think the big difference probably came between, so I studied law at university, and I couldn't really understand. I had this feeling of discomfort around some of the human rights work that was happening in Northern Ireland, and I couldn't understand why. It's human rights, it's about kind of justice and that. And in a break between doing the undergraduate and the postgraduate degree, I went and I worked for an organisation called Mediation Northern Ireland. And there, in my thinking, I was able to see the difference between strict legal advocacy and activism on one side in relation to human rights, and the mediation approach that was kind of trying to work on relationships and conversations and dialogue. And this was in the immediate post-agreement phase. So there was a lot of money being put into this type of activity. There was a lot of emphasis on building and repairing relationships, on enabling people to live together in the everyday, if you like, addressing some of the legacies of policing and that sort of thing. And that I think was really a turning point. So fundamentally, that organisation is about non-violence and about dialogue, and to me that was convincing. I could see it making a difference. I could see how it was helping the people who were engaging with these programs. And so from then, I think all of my work has been dedicated a little bit to trying to understand the dynamics of how we ask for justice and how we recognize when other people are asking for justice. Because a lot of there's still, I mean, in Northern Ireland, it hasn't gone away. It's getting in many ways worse. The conversation over legacy, it's getting more polarized, it's getting more divisive. And, you know, you've got people there who lost relatives, you've got, you know, people who have really suffered violence, who are asking for justice, and who are basically being told that they don't deserve it, you know. And so I think that the question for me is always, how do we understand that? How do we recognize the demand for justice? And how do we encourage people to listen to that? How do we encourage people to recognize it? And that comes very much then, the thinking reverts for me then to the mediation side of things. How do we build those relationships? How do we enable people to hear the demand for justice? So the mediation doesn't replace it. It doesn't do away with a demand for justice or for accountability. But in my thinking, it's a step towards it, because once you recognize the validity, or you acknowledge the validity of somebody's demand for justice, then it's easier to think about what that justice might look like. But if we go straight in and say, well, this is justice, this is accountability, this is what we have to do, then what we're seeing is that it just becomes polarized. People stick to their sides, and they become less and less open to hearing why other people might be making a justice claim. So I think for sure, and knowing as well, you know, the experience of living in a conflict, and knowing that most of what's going on is unsaid, you know, so a lot of the thinking around legacy is invisible to people who don't live through it, don't understand kind of the politics of the everyday. I think that makes a difference to me as well, particularly in terms of the extent to which outsiders can be experts in other countries' transitional justice processes. And so very much, you know, the idea of that you can go in as an external expert and say that this is what we'll do and this is how it works, without a knowledge, without an experience of that conflict, it to me is uncomfortable. You know, that it very much, if the role for outsiders or the role for expertise is a facilitative one, you know, that comes with a little bit of humility of we understand that these things are very complex. This is our experience, this is how it might help, but that's fundamentally a facilitation of other people articulating their own justice demands and what would work for them. And there's differences, obviously, you know, at the top level between men and women, sometimes between different groups, depending on how they've experienced the conflict. But fundamentally, it's a facilitative role rather than an expertise on an epistemic basis. Sorry, that's a bit long, but that all comes from, I think, observing these debates in Northern Ireland over about 20 years now. Mm-hmm.
No, that's fascinating. And I wanted to pick up on something you said about the dynamics of some people continuing to call for justice and perhaps worried a little bit about legacy, but kind of other parties to the conflict perhaps being worried about their legacy and their how they are presented, and the historical record, kind of the agreed upon history. I think we see that in the United States. I think we see that in a lot of contexts, that some people are still living the after effects of human rights abuse, atrocity, and conflict. And some people, often who may or may not have also be living those after effects, have a very different perspective and view it as the past, and the past is the past, and aren't really receptive to those voices or to reopening that. I think it's misframed a lot as a debate, but as you're saying, that dialogue. But also with dialogue, one of the core principles is that you're agreeing to come together to make a change together. There's some promise of change or agreement to work together towards a different outcome, to find something together. So how do you promote the hearing of the voices? How do you soften the climate? And you mentioned politics. How do you make it so that those calls for justice and accountability are not simply kind of pushed under the rug, or it's just, oh, this is the past? I mean, I think that's at the heart of a lot of TJ processes. There has to be some will from the different parties to continue dialoguing, or to start dialoguing, or to look at the past. And some people do not have an interest in looking at the past. So I wonder, like, to me, this seems kind of a blockage. How do you maybe you don't see it as a blockage? How do you see it, and where to from there, kind of?
You know, I see it as a fundamental difficulty and I think, again, this comes from the idea of that we have an agreement and then we hand over and do the transitional justice, you know, but all of that is already shaped by what has come before. And like, I have heard some interesting discussion around it. So a couple of years ago, we had a workshop on identity and peace mediation. And somebody from USIP talked about ontological security in terms of why people would oppose these universal goods of peace, of justice, for example, and the idea of the threat. And so I think, and this is where a very adversarial legal approach can make that worse. You know, it doesn't do anything to allay fears around what's going to happen. I mean, and in some cases that's appropriate. In some cases, just justice needs to be done. But in terms of creating a climate where it's less frightening, this really is in my mind at the moment, and I don't have an answer at the moment, but I'm thinking really very much through listening. And transitional justice itself, I mean, if I've read its origins correctly, it always was a compromise. It was always, you know, it was a separate form of justice because it needed to be negotiated. And no matter how much we would like it to be strongly normative, like no matter how much we would like to be able to go into Afghanistan and say, you've got to do this transitional justice now, you know, in every case and at every level, it has to be negotiated in some way. And so I think trying to learn a little bit from those techniques in peace mediation, where you're trying to get over resistance, where you're trying to encourage people to come to the table, and they're definitely listening and recognition is a part of that. And we're seeing, it's really interesting because here in Northern Ireland, there was a big project that applied in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, transitional justice to historical institutional abuse. There's abuse of children in homes and things, and then to women in mother and baby homes as well. And when I first heard about that, I was a little bit skeptical because to me, transitional justice and that element of negotiation implied that, or often there was violence or wrongdoing on both sides. And it was a way of kind of acknowledging the wrongness of that and accountability for that. And I was struggling with the idea that you could apply this to a context where children had been abused. But actually the way that they've done it has been really impressive, because it has brought in this idea of bringing forward the voice, you know, of the children effectively who were in these homes, who were abused in these homes, and asking people to listen to them and asking people to say, well, this is why they deserve justice. And that has been effective. And there was, and I think even more so in Northern Ireland than in the Republic. So there's definitely something in the idea of asking people to listen and asking them to recognize why the person should be entitled to it. And in some ways that broke ground. That has been more successful than the political legacy work, because it's not politically controversial. So the question for me would be, how do we take that learning and how do we make it work where it's politically controversial? You know, so where there's questions over the innocence of your victims, for example, and dispute over who's entitled to justice and who's not. It's been more difficult there. But I think if we were able to work from that, to build up from it and think about what additionally needs to be done in political contexts, then it would be a good starting place for thinking and using some of those techniques then of dialogue from mediation field.
Have you observed any like generational differences in that someone who wasn't involved in the conflict or wasn't the mother and baby homes have closed, or, in the United States and Canada, the Indigenous person, First Nation, Native American, Amerindian residential schools have closed fairly recently, actually, within our lifetimes. And so it's speaking with a whole kind of cohort of people, a generation that was not in the power position, that wasn't necessarily perpetrating the abuse or wasn't fighting in the conflict or a party to the conflict. Is there an idea that they're more receptive or maybe more apt to active listening, or to because they feel a sense of removal from it, versus people who were implicated in it, and therefore it's more complicated for them to unthink their learned behaviors, their conditioning, although young people can be conditioned as well into these legacies that they've learned from their communities and their parents. So maybe it does not matter. Maybe it's not age so much as it is some other factor that makes certain people more apt to actively listen, more apt to investigate the past and listen to victims and survivors.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some people are open to it and some people aren't. And I think it's even the difference between activism and mediation when it comes to how we approach, how we put these questions on the agenda. They're both equally valid and both very different ways of coming to that question. I think for sure those who don't aren't specifically themselves implicated in these things are maybe more open to recognizing and acknowledging when things were done wrong. It's difficult because, again, going back to the ontological security point, in many cases, all of these cases, with whether it's political violence, whether it's religious orders, for example, people have got really, really deeply, parts of their core identity are being challenged by these justice claims, in terms of how they justified their life choices, how they justified what they did. And so that, I think, is something that needs to be taken into account when you ask them to do that sort of thing, that you're asking them to go on a journey that takes them from a place of defending what they did and trying to push back against and disprove the justice claim to a place where they're willing to listen and to hear that. And that's probably easier if you haven't devoted your entire life to it, so if you say you have been a member of an armed group and you missed your entire family life because you were on the run all of the time, to then be told, well, now you've got to say that all of that was wrong and it didn't mean anything and it shouldn't have happened. That's difficult. But we are seeing as well, though, intergenerational kind of passing on of this. And it's quite a worrying time because young people who have no experience of living with violence, valorizing violence, valorizing membership of armed groups and the power that comes with that, and advocating in some occasions, advocating using that again, as a way of making one's point or trying to kind of become important. And so I think that that's a very real risk because the disconnection. So those who remember the violence, those who know what it was like, more open to the question of that, well, we don't want to go back to that, and what do we need to do to prevent us from going back to that? Those who have no experience of it don't have that frame of reference of what we don't want to experience, and that's a riskier place in my view, because in the early parts of the violence in Northern Ireland, the young men who were being sent to jail were in their late teens and their early 20s, and that generation now has not known violence and is talking about violence. So to me, it's a dangerous position. It's a dangerous place, and that the money that we had in the early post-agreement years for dialogue and encounter and all of that type of work, that's the work of mediation and peace building and social cohesion, that money sort of dried up, got diverted to different types of projects, and so we don't have the same, I think, infrastructural safety net anymore that we had when we were working with the generation who had been directly involved in it, and so in a way the youth are actually quite a priority, I would say, in terms of how we talk with them about violence and about political difference and how we deal with these justice claims that are unresolved and that continue to create division and hurt in families and communities.
And as you mentioned, funding, I was thinking about resources because it seems like there's an international attention span on a peace process, on a mediation process, and then some maybe initial funding of a certain courts. For example, I've seen the courts in Sarajevo and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they have, they had at the time panels where they would have an international judge who would be along with Bosnian judges hearing cases, but that isn't going to be, that was funded for quite a while, but these things aren't funded for decades and decades. And working in the international sphere, projects are funded for a year, 2 years. So it seems like there's kind of an attention span, and then there's this like slow trickle of maybe continuous funding, whereas the after effects of the conflict will last for generations. But I actually wanted to ask you about something you mentioned earlier, which is the role of also the international community, but coming in and being kind of technical advisors, technical experts on peace mediation, peace negotiation, or transitional justice. And actually with the American Society, or with ACIL's, Minorities in International Law Interest Group, the TJ Rolig group is organizing in 2022 an event on where we'd like to look at inclusion and diversity in the international body of expertise that advises on peace agreements and on peace processes, because it seems as if there's a lot of in a conflict where the international community is urging a certain representation by political party, by armed group, by gender, by region, by religion, by ethnicity or race, that then international experts who are advising are all too often men and white men of European heritage. So it's not a very diverse necessarily group of international experts. And it's kind of, as you were saying, like the voices, this integration of the voices of lived experience of conflict, like that's trying to happen in the peace process. But then the facilitators and mediators are not always, very representative of the global population, much less the population of this conflict. So I guess I was wondering how, if this is your experience, or perhaps you have had different experiences, but how do you see this international cadre of like TJ and peace experts? Like, what is our role, and how do we be more inclusive and diversify this space?
I mean, I think it's a really good question. Partly, I think some of this is starting to be acknowledged in the political side of the mediation, in terms of their more recent emphasis on local mediation, and the capacity of local communities themselves to produce mediators and deal with these types of conflicts. I think as well So I often wondered what to do with this, particularly when women were saying, well, these experts came in and they said this is what we were going to do, but nothing happened, and actually it didn't address what I wanted it to address. And then obviously there is this capacity problem, and we have different levels of processes for that reason. The ICC is clear that they only deal with high level because they're dealing with kind of internationally significant crimes. But I think the ways in which the particularly capacity building and training are set up. And I struggled with this myself. So like I said at the beginning, do I go in and say, here is what we do and how we do transitional justice? And I decided that actually, no, that was that wasn't the best way to do it. And so as a compromise, then what the approach that I sort of have adopted has been that we can use these strategically as tools. So if you want to engage in the debate, this is the dominant language. This is what's listened to. This is what you can use to get funded, and how you engage with the international actors when they come to your country. So if you're able to articulate your demands broadly within this framework, it's a common language for people to understand. Now, I don't think that that's enough. I think it's a good way of trying to give people tools that they can use to get into conversations that are happening. I would prefer that the way the conversations happen change, so that those people are there from the outset, rather than having it shaped for them, and then they're just invited into it. And so part of that is then, how do we capture it? How do we facilitate and capture this knowledge from people themselves around what transitional justice would look like for them, and then whether or not that reconciles or needs to be reconciled with the frameworks that we have, or whether we need to think about expanding the foundation of transitional justice and looking outside more often those kind of technical boxes. So I would like to see very much more a sort of learning from people who are doing transitional justice themselves in their own contexts, and what it means to them.
And it's through inclusion that those discussions happen. And also, as you said, through interrogating the frameworks, because we talk about not applying a blueprint, but it is true that there are the pillars. There is kind of a language around transitional justice. There's a language around, there's a toolbox sorts. And that is just not always conducive to, or culturally appropriate in a certain society.
And again, this is where we're talking exactly the same debate in peace mediation and in transitional justice. You know, do we keep doing this kind of approach of training and capacity building to take part in these processes that actually aren't set up to allow you to make a difference? Or do we go back to the start and say, well, what does justice really mean? And as some of the literature is great on this, some of the academic work is really good. It's just how do we filter that in? So this gap, I think, is particularly in transitional justice is persistent, shall we say, you know, between the scholarship that's willing to interrogate what justice means and to look at the different ways that people engage in these questions, and versus then what remains the dominant understanding in international policy circles of what transitional justice is and how we support people to be involved in transitional justice. Mm-hmm. So it's, I mean, how do we address that disconnect, I suppose, would be a question.
I also wonder if there's more freedom in the scholarly circles to interrogate, to have discussion, debate, and present different frameworks, whereas being kind of in certain institutions, you're on the practitioner side, although I think all of this is practice, and you're reading these articles, you're wondering how to integrate it. You might agree, but it's just business as usual. You're in a large bureaucracy, you're being seconded or sent. And so I think there's like some organizational inertia. There's almost like a need for organizational change within the big, you know, the United Nations perhaps, or other groups that are doing this to take into account. Although I think also there are a lot of individuals in those groups who are receptive, who are reading the academic literature and who are affecting change. So it's not to say change isn't happening. It's just updating the frameworks takes, you know, a decade or something, whereas many things have transpired in those 10 years.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's a system issue, and you know, people are just trying to keep up with the demands of their job, and in many ways. So I can sit as an academic with the luxury of time to think about these things and say, but yeah, you're right. It's it takes time. It takes time.
It's also like, thank goodness there is the academic scholarship that people are hungry for and are using. I see Noha had a question. Noha, if you want to go on video and ask your question, please feel free. I see you put it in the chat, so I will start reading it. But please feel free to jump on. She asked, do you find that certain types of mediation are more conducive to transitional justice discussions than others? For example, track 2 negotiations and other types of mediation.
Yeah, so I think again, it depends on how you're defining what it is you want to achieve. You know, so if you're trying to force parties into an agreement on transitional justice, for example, then the same kind of diplomacy and high level sort of high level negotiation is going to apply. Where I think it's really useful is at the track 2 and the track 3 in some ways, the facilitative style of mediation that tries to create structures whereby people are able to communicate with each other, you know, that builds up confidence and trust. The parties would be able to work together to achieve these types of goals. So I think definitely the more creative track 2 approaches and the track 3 encounter type approaches as well, that recognize that some of this is very difficult because people fundamentally don't trust each other, you know, and they've got histories of violence between families, between communities, that's very deep rooted in people's minds, and that mediation itself is supposed to be a process to address that, and the facilitative style that's often used in those processes is much less about brokering an agreement or an outcome, and more about the structures of how we live together and how we get on and how we start to talk about these difficult issues around justice and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the use of the word creativity, because I think that begets change, and that makes people less kind of invested in, who are creative might be less invested in the status quo, or see something in the status quo that isn't working. So moving from that high level formal people who are the status quo, moving down to the informal people who perhaps don't hold positions of formal power, but have a great deal of a social network, a lived experience, that is power as well.
Yeah, and they have to feel safe to do that. And I think mediation really emphasizes that confidence building, trust building as a core part of mediation practice, recognizes that these are difficult conversations for people to have, and that you're only going to make progress when people feel safe, and that this can be, you know, a slightly longer process than you might want, and that it can break down at any point. And but that often also that happening in the background can help stabilize things as well, both above and below.
Mm-hmm. Something that just jumped to my mind, it's from a little bit ago though, when we were talking about kind of that academic and practitioner field and how it's quite fluid. People know each other, people go to the same events, people speak to each other. I was just wondering, when you're co-authoring papers or you're editing a book or you're working on a chapter, how do you seek out, like, who do you seek out? How do you work with others? Like, when you're, like, what is your network like? And how do you kind of pull in these different, the local experience, the experience of another conflict, post-conflict context, or someone who's from this kind of more institutional, international cadre? Like, how are you in your research, your scholarship, your teaching, your work, basically like making these networks, and how do you choose who to work with?
Yeah, so a few different. So where I started with this is that very much I'm a theorist, and that's quite a lonely, quite a lonely position. But I theorized through Northern Ireland though, because I was confident in my reading of the sources and in who was telling me what and why. I was really quite confident that I was able to judge that. I was able to read the silences. I knew what wasn't being said as well as what was being said, and so that was equally the case for the book, The Violence, Law and the Impossibility of Transitional Justice, but also the more recent work on women's participation and protection of women in Northern Ireland. On a number of occasions, it really struck me that my knowledge of Northern Ireland meant that I was able to read silences in a way that could potentially skew research findings if you didn't know how to do that. So if you came in from outside, somebody told you this particular piece of information and you took it at face value, that you could potentially produce something not entirely intended, if you know what I mean. So that, and that really sticks with me. I wouldn't profess expertise in somebody else's country. So what I've tried to do then, if I'm looking at another country, is to work through the scholarship of those who are from the country, and to develop networks and develop in conversation with people who do know the region, who have experience of it, and who know, the extent to which what's coming out in the Western media, for example, or in Western magazine sources, is an accurate reflection, but also then the silences and what's not being said there. And in that work then as well, anywhere that, so because of this, the work has more recently with women, it's a lot of it's been in Northern Ireland, but it has really tried to centre those voices, so to say that this is something that's been told to me, but this is theirs, this is their voice, and I'm trying to amplify it by putting it in these global frameworks that highlight what the issue is, but fundamentally it's the voice of the people taking part in the research themselves, that's the centre of it, and not me taking credit for their experience and for their knowledge. Yeah. So and as I say, really the way that I have found most comfortable to deal with that is to not present myself ever as an expert in somebody else's conflict, to try and engage with people in an equal conversation about other people's conflicts, but not to try and profess it myself.
But it's also not saying that since you're from, for example, in your case, Northern Ireland, that you can't speak credibly to, like, because you're kind of in it or were in it or have in this context of it, that you aren't credible, that like we know about what we have lived through and what we see. And I think that poignant phrase of like reading, did you say reading the silence?
Yeah,
that's really beautiful. I think that's, for me, that's something that's going to stick with me, because that's true. There are things that go unsaid that you can read, or body language, or reading between the lines. That's really validating as well, someone's cultural and societal knowledge. We have 2 questions in the chat from Wes. Westeros. In the atrocity prevention community, we see continually that the failure to address the issues that transitional justice processes are designed to engage with, justice, accountability, peace building, etc., leads directly to increased risks of further atrocities. Is there a way to improve political engagement with TJ processes by emphasizing the preventative elements of future atrocity risks to politicians and funders?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear. I mean, going back again to the start of the discussion around how the peace mediation shapes the possibilities of transitional justice, I think equally the failure to implement anything in relation to transitional justice, the failure to meet those commitments destabilizes peace processes because people lose confidence in them. They see that like what was promised hasn't been delivered, and why should they continue to live up to their side of the bargain? And that seems to be quite a big risk that's underexplored in terms of transitional justice, where we separate them, where we have the agreement and then we have the transitional justice, and we don't think about why the transitional justice isn't being implemented. I think if we were to close that loop, we could be able to make a strong case that this is part of an implementation, and the mediation doesn't end or shouldn't end with an agreement, but that needs to continue into an implementation phase, and that part of that is supporting people to keep that pressure on, supporting people to keep working towards those goals. And so, and sometimes I wonder, like, that there's political capital in not addressing it. And so the more you strengthen kind of that middle ground, if you like, the more you strengthen the capacity of people to say, this is what we want, this is what we're demanding, and it's not politically polarized, the clearer the message should be. The more it becomes polarized, the more it plays into the hands of those who say, well, we can't do it because it's destabilizing, or we can't do it, or we're not going to do it because we're holding the power and you have nothing at the moment. So it's really about that constituency of who's demanding it, and how you try and build that and consolidate that in an implementation phase, rather than just sort of withdrawing the support and the funding after the first few years. To me, that would be a way to do it, to emphasize that the failure to do this actually undermines the possibilities of your peace agreement lasting in the kind of mid to long term.
It strikes me
empirically unproven, but my thoughts.
Really enriching. I think one thing that I thought of too when you were mentioning after the agreement, because I work on the Sahel, formerly Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, currently Burkina Faso, that in Mali there has been a peace agreement, whereas in Burkina Faso, different context. It's not a context in which there was an agreement, but both had transitional justice processes that were quite consultative, and a lot of gathering of statements, gathering of reports of atrocities and abuses has been done, but the momentum, the funding, the attention, the priorities are elsewhere now. And these are both in Mali and Burkina Faso, there are increasing instances and incidents of violence against ethnic minorities, intercommunal or interethnic violence and tensions, and a breakdown of social cohesion in a context marked by violent extremism that's persisted for years now. Despite quite a bit of international and regional and local attention. So it's also that, like, issues left unaddressed breed resentment, distrust, mistrust, exclusion, marginalization, whether there's an agreement or not. But also, if the international community is committed, there can be attention and support of local scholars, local activists to do this work. So I think sometimes it's something for the international practitioners to realize, like, a certain program of a certain length is simply kind of irresponsible at a certain level if you're working in atrocity prevention and in stopping conflict and saving lives, or ending situations where life is at risk.
Yeah, and I think it's really worth asking as well, in terms of particularly where the priorities are defined at quite a high level and with external influence, what impact are they having on the dynamics on the ground? Like, are they speaking to the priorities? Are they making them worse? You know, are they marginalizing certain groups that actually need to be brought in for geopolitical reasons, for example, or are they simply just not taking into account what would stabilize things. I mean, stabilization as the framework isn't ideal, but are they asking why, why conflict would persist? Is there a gap between what they have said are the priorities and what's actually manifesting on the ground? I think that would be interesting to look at as well in those contexts.
I see we have another question here from Noha Abu Dahab. And she mentioned, what would you say are some areas of the academic and policy literature on mediation and transitional justice that are particularly underexplored?
Well, I think the interdependencies between the two. I really am interested and keep thinking about mapping this out, around the ways in which they are mutually reinforcing, so that the success of one can breed success of the other, but likewise the failure of one can bring failure of the other. So I really would like to map that out in terms of where they aren't parallel, where they're actually interdependent as processes. I think that would be one really interesting one to do. I think the dialogue of the global and the local, that the connections between those fields. So where's the learning across peace studies, I suppose it is, and transitional justice on the local and the everyday. What tools could we take one from the other in terms of articulating priorities? And there was another one in my mind there, and it's gone out. And this, yes, this question that's going through the whole conversation here about the expertise and the experience, how do we articulate justice in a way that isn't something that's kind of externally decided, but that's flexible enough to respond to and to incorporate justice demands as they are made? How do we hear those rather than coming in with our own assumptions of what a transitional justice process will look like? And also, I think, how do we make it multi-layered? How do we acknowledge that maybe in some cases kind of high-level atrocity prevention, genocide prosecutions, those sorts of things are necessary, and in many ways they have to be negotiated in one way. So they're part of the peace process, they're part of the mediator's mandate and things like that. But that's not negotiated in the same way as justice is negotiated at the grassroots. So how do we make this multi-level? How do we enable the parts to be moving separately and together so that failure to implement accountability for genocide or crimes against humanity, for example, political stalemate, how do we enable grassroots levels initiatives to be continuing even when that stalemate is happening, so that failure in one doesn't mean failure of transitional justice per se, but it's just failure of that one part, and there's other parts of justice working at the same time. So I think seeing it less as a single and linear process, and seeing it more as multi-layered and with lots of different things happening that may feed into each other, but that equally may not, that may just be standalone in the way that they operate. And I think that applies to both fields.
So I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about what's next for you, what you're focusing on in 2022, and also I'd like to introduce also the Works in Progress workshop that the Transitional Justice and Rule of Law Interest Group at ACIL is organizing with you on in 2022 at this nexus of peace, mediation, and transitional justice. So maybe if you want to talk about your work and like what's looking at, down the horizon, what you see, and then the what we're looking for with this workshop and the call for submissions.
Okay, yeah. So the most, I suppose the next thing that's coming up is that there's a new edition of the Research Handbook of Transitional Justice coming out, I think towards the end of next year. So I'm updating my chapter a little bit together with Maya Davidovich. We're going to do a mapping of the interdisciplinary nature of transitional justice scholarship. So trying to just get a sense, I suppose for an interested person new to the field, of where not just the mechanisms, but also kind of the core tenets of transitional justice, like truth and justice, where they're being talked about in different disciplinary bodies of literature, and what that tells us about the field. So we're going to be working on trying to bring that together. And also then the works in progress with NOHA was really our way of asking, who's working on this, and to challenge people a little bit in their thinking, so that it's not just, okay, I am working on transitional justice, and yes, there's a peace process, but I don't really think about that because I work on transitional justice. But to challenge people to think about what are the connections, what could we learn from looking at these two things together. So hoping people will come up with some ideas on that. And quite broadly, I'm interested, I suppose, in the definitional aspect of these, so how there's clearly within both peace mediation and transitional justice, we've got multiple different understandings of what the core foundation of the field is. So what's the meaning of justice? What's the meaning of peace? Okay, and in justice, it tends to come towards legal justice, tends to come towards accountability, prosecution, but the literature is growing so much that there are clearly different understandings of justice. And I think in a lot of the programming like that you do, there are different ways of supporting justice as well. So I'm interested in whether there are common epistemic foundations and the extent to which there's a common epistemic foundation of justice that underpins that field, or peace that underpins peace mediation. So that's what I'm going to be looking at in the next little while, along with the listening, the theory of listening. So yeah, I hope some people will join us.
Yes, we don't have a date set for it yet, is my understanding. And then to Lisa Labante's question about when is the deadline and was it extended for the call for submissions? I believe it's extended, but we haven't yet set the actual deadline.
Yes, a number of people pointed out that perhaps we didn't give people enough time to think about this question. Okay. We agreed and said we extended. So
okay, and we will share that in the ASIL email world. And also I noticed you posted on rethinkingpeacemediation.com in the call. So I'm going to post it there again, and we can also tweet it out. I'll also share the TJ Rolig email. And then Catherine, did you have any closing remarks? Anything you didn't get to say that you wanted to highlight? Any contact information you might want to share, or socials or anything like that?
No, I just want to say thank you very much again for the opportunity. If people are working on this, I would love to hear about it, because there's kind of big questions, and I really would like to see, I suppose, that this technical, I think about the peace mediation field as becoming technical solutions to ethical problems. And there's the same risk with justice as well, that we reduce it down to pillars and mechanisms. And so I just, if anybody else is working on that, that's what I'm thinking about. So
solutions to ethical problems.
But thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending, and wishing you a nice rest of your night or day.